When was the flush toilet invented?
The invention dates to the 1590s and is credited to Sir John Harington. 1561 to 1612, hence its nickname, the John. A courtier and godson of England's Queen Elizabeth I, 1533 to 1603. Harington installed a flush lavatory in one of the Queen's palaces. Though he was a serious scholar and translator, Harington was also a rebel who wrote controversial satire, leading to his banishment. His invention of the so-called water closet was not taken seriously in its day. But over the following 2 centuries various inventors worked to improve it, ultimately developing the plumbed sanitary toilet, a flush commode that is connected to plumbing and sewers or septic tanks.
What were wildcat banks?
Wildcat banks were state-chartered financial institutions that operated in the United States from the early 1800s until the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. They were known as wildcat banks for their free lending policies and their issue of paper currency that could not be backed up by gold or silver, called specie. The Second National Bank of the United States operated between 1816 and 1836, during which time the federally controlled bank was able to restrain the wildcat institutions, which predominated in the West and South, requiring them to issue only what currency they could convert to coin. But when the charter of the Second National Bank of the United States was allowed to expire in 1836, the wildcat banks resumed their unsound banking practices. Paper currency issue and lending went unregulated amidst a rush to buy lands on the frontier. The nation's currency wildly fluctuated as the renegade financial institutions loosened and tightened the money supply to suit their own needs. Further, since there were so many banks issuing their own notes, another problem introduced itself: counterfeiting. No one could tell what was true bank currency and what was the product of a good counterfeiter. With inflation rampant and land speculation at a new high, on July 11, 1836, President Andrew Jackson, 1767 to 1845, intent on reining in the wildcat banks, issued the Specie Circular, an order that government agents accept nothing but gold or silver as payment for new lands. When prospective land buyers, particularly in the West, took their paper bills to the state-chartered banks to be converted to coin, they found the banks' tills were empty, and the holders were therefore denied the face value of their notes. Bank after bank closed its doors, causing a financial panic in 1837. But many state banks remained in business, and the issue of regulating paper currency continued to trouble the nation.
How are religions classified?
Religion, which is a system of beliefs that usually centers on whatever is beyond the known or the natural, is commonly divided between elementary forms and higher religions. Some elementary forms, or traditional religions, are animism, the belief in spirits in nature or in natural objects, ancestor worship, revering the spirits of the dead, and totemism, belief in a mystical relationship between a group of people and an emblem. Animists might believe in spirits living in the sea or in the mountains. Believers in ancestor worship will both honor and fear the spirits of dead family members for if they are neglected by the living. These spirits are believed to be able to bring harm to their descendants. Within clans, some tribal peoples adopt totems, such as a lion or a turtle. Totemists will be careful throughout their lives not to harm the animal or object that serves as their clan's emblem. Higher religions are those that embody a concept of transcendence. Higher religions are classified as polytheistic, believing in many gods, dualistic, believing in equally powerful gods of good and evil, monotheistic, believing in one God, and pantheistic, believing in God as the forces and laws of the universe, or the worship of all gods. Religions are further classified as revealed or non-revealed. Revealed religions are those that followers know through divine agency. Both Christianity and Islam are revealed religions. Non-revealed religions, such as Buddhism, Brahmanism, or Taoism, are known only through inquiry.
When was the first movie shown?
On March 22, 1895, the first in-theater showing of a motion picture took place in Paris. When the members of the Société d'Encouragement à l'Industrie Nationale, National Society for the Promotion of Industry, gathered to see a film of workers leaving the Lumière factory at Lyons for their dinner hour. The cinematography of inventors Louis, 1864–1948, and Augusta, 1862–1954, Lumière, ages 31 and 33 respectively, was a vast improvement over the kinetoscope. Introduced in 1894 by Thomas Edison, whose film could only be viewed by one person at a time. The 16 frame per second mechanism developed by the Lumière brothers became the standard for films for decades. The following year, on April 20, 1896, the first motion picture showing in the United States took place in New York. The film was shown using Thomas Edison's vitascope, which was an improvement on his kinetoscope, and a projector made by Thomas Armat.
When was insulin discovered?
Insulin, a hormone that regulates sugar levels in the body, was first discovered in 1889 by German physiologist Oskar Minkowski, 1858–1931, and German physician Joseph von Mering, 1849–1908. They observed that the removal of the pancreas caused diabetes in dogs. Researchers set about isolating the substance, but it was not until 1922 that insulin was used to treat diabetic patients. The first genetically engineered human insulin was produced by American scientists in 1978.
Who invented the skyscraper?
The credit is usually given to American architect William Jenney, 1832 to 1907, who designed the 10-story home insurance building, erected on the corner of LaSalle and Monroe Streets in Chicago in 1885. The building was the first in which the entire structure was of skeleton construction of cast iron, wrought iron, and Bessemer steel. However, some experts believe the first skyscraper to have been designed was one by the American firm Halliburton and Roche, also in Chicago. The firm, founded by two former students of Jenney, designed the skeleton frame Tacoma building, which was actually not completed until 1889. Both the home insurance building and the Tacoma building were demolished in 1931 and 1929, respectively. It was the use of steel, the innovation of a safe elevator, and the use of central heating that combined to make possible the construction of tall buildings toward the end of the 19th century. Once the trend had started, it quickly took off. Another Chicago firm, Burnham and Root, Burnham, too, had been a student of Jenney, completed the 14-story Reliance building in 1895. It had a steel skeleton frame. The further development of the skyscraper is visible in the Gage buildings in Chicago, two of which were designed by Halliburton and Roche, and one by Lewis Henry Sullivan. 1856 to 1924, the Chicago architect often credited for mastering the skyscraper. Other Chicago skyscrapers built by Halliburton and Roche during the early days of modern architecture include the Marquette Building, 1894, and the Tribune Building, 1901.
Did Michelangelo study anatomy?
Yes, in 1492 Michelangelo Buonarroti, 1475 to 1564, a master sculptor of the human form, undertook the study of anatomy based on the dissection of corpses from the Hospital of Santo Spirito. Perhaps most well known for his sculptures of David, 1501-04, and Moses, 1515-15. As well as his frescoes on the ceiling and walls of the Sistine Chapel, Michelangelo was also an architect who believed that buildings should follow the form of the human body to the extent of disposing units symmetrically around a central and unique axis, in a relationship like that of the arms to the body. He also wrote poetry. He was a true Renaissance man. Michelangelo was totally absorbed in his work and was known to be impatient with himself and with others. He has been likened to German composer Ludwig van Beethoven. 1770 to 1827, since the personal letters of both men reveal a deep sympathy and concern for those close to them, and profound understanding of humanity informs their works. Gardner's art through the ages.
How did America get its name?
America is derived from the name of Italian navigator Amerigo Vespucci, 1454–1512, who took part in several early voyages to the New World. Vespucci had been a merchant in service of the Medici family in Florence, and later moved to Spain, where he worked for the company that outfitted the ships for Christopher Columbus's 1451–1506 second and third voyages. He sailed with the Spaniards on several expeditions, in 1497, 1499, 1501, and 1503. Though scholars today question his role as an explorer, in a work by German geographer Martin Waldseemüller, c. 1470 c. 1520, published in 1507, the author credited Vespucci with realizing that he had actually arrived in a new world, not in the Far East as other explorers, including Columbus, had believed. Thus, Waldseemüller suggested the new lands be named America after Amerigo Vespucci. For his part, Waldseemüller was led to believe this by Vespucci himself, who had written to Lorenzo de' Medici in 1502 or 1503, relaying his discovery of a new continent and vividly describing it. About a year later, the letter was published under the title Mundus Novus, New World, which was translated and published in future editions. The designation America was used again in 1538 by Flemish cartographer Gerardus Mercator. Gerhard Kremer, 1512–1594. Today the term in the singular refers to either continent in the Western Hemisphere and sometimes specifically to the United States. In the plural, it refers to all of the lands of the Western Hemisphere, including North and South America and the West Indies.
Why is Charlemagne so well known?
Charlemagne's popularity with history students is due not only to the ruler's great accomplishments during his lifetime, but also to the fact that these accomplishments were documented. His biography, titled Vita Caroli Magna, The Life of Charlemagne, was written by a fellow named Einhard, c. 770–840, who was his advisor. Charlemagne, 742–814, or Charles the Great, became king of the Western Franks when his father, Pepin the Short, c. 714–768, died in 768. Upon the death of his brother Carloman, in 771, Charles became king of all the Franks. He then went on to conquer much of Western Europe, including Saxony, Lombardy, northeastern Spain, and Bavaria. He sometimes employed brutal tactics in bringing people and regions under control. During the last 2 decades of the 8th century, he used mass executions to subdue Saxon rebellions. Charlemagne succeeded in uniting all of these areas under one empire. And on Christmas Day 800, he had Pope Leo III, c. 750 to 816, crown him Emperor of the West, thus initiating the Holy Roman Empire. As a patron of the arts, literature, and science, Charlemagne revived Western Europe, which had been in decline since the fall of the West Roman Empire, in 476. He is credited with laying the foundation for the Holy Roman Empire and the European civilization that developed later in the Middle Ages. He ruled until his death in 814.
When was the first solo non-stop transatlantic flight made?
It was in 1927, on May 21, at 10:24 p.m. American Charles A. Lindbergh, 1902 to 1974, landed his single-engine monoplane, the Spirit of St. Louis, at Le Bourget Airfield, Paris, after completing the first solo non-stop transatlantic flight. Lindbergh, declining to take a radio in order to save weight for an additional 90 gallons of gasoline, had taken off in the rain from Roosevelt Field, Long Island, New York. At 7:55 a.m. on May 20. The plane was so heavy with gasoline, a total of 451 gallons of it, that the Spirit of St. Louis had barely cleared telephone wires upon takeoff. Lindbergh covered 3,600 miles, about a third of it through snow and sleet, in 33 hours, 29 minutes. He won a $25,000 prize, which was offered in 1919, and became a world hero hailed as the Lone Eagle. His autobiography, titled The Spirit of St. Louis, published 1953, won the aviator the Pulitzer Prize.
How old is the game of billiards?
The Italians were the first to play this table game, in the 1550s. It's different than pool, since billiards requires the players to cause the cue ball to hit 2 object balls in succession. There are no pockets, as there are in pool.
What are the Geneva Conventions?
The Geneva Conventions are humanitarian treaties signed by almost all of the approximately 200 nations in the world today. There were 189 signatories as of 2003. The treaties were forged in Geneva, Switzerland, in 1864, 1906, 1929, and 1949. The initial protocols, of 1864, gave rise to the Red Cross. There were 2 amendments, called Protocols, in 1977. In their entirety, the Geneva Conventions set standards for how signatory nations are to treat the enemy during war. They cover access to and treatment of battlefield casualties, treatment of prisoners of war, POWs, and the treatment of civilians. The summaries of each convention and protocol are as follows. Convention I. For the amelioration of the condition of the wounded and sick in armed forces in the field. Sets forth the protections for members of the armed forces who become wounded or sick. Convention II, for the amelioration of the condition of wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of armed forces at sea. Extends protections to wounded, sick, and shipwrecked members of the naval forces. Convention III, relative to the treatment of prisoners of war, Geneva. Lists the rights of prisoners of war. Convention IV, relative to the protection of civilian persons in time of war, Geneva. Deals with the protection of the civilian population in times of war. All four conventions were ratified as a whole in 1949. Protocol I. Additional to the Geneva Conventions of August 12, 1949, and relating to the protection of victims of international armed conflicts. Extends protections to victims of wars against racist regimes and wars of self-determination. Protocol II, additional to the Geneva Conventions of August 12, 1949. And relating to the protection of victims of non-international armed conflicts. Extends protections to victims of internal conflicts in which an armed opposition controls enough territory to enable them to carry out sustained military operations. The Geneva Conventions, along with the Hague Conventions, 1899, 1907, comprise much of what is called international humanitarian law, IHL. Because so many nations of the world have ratified both the Geneva Conventions and the Hague Conventions, they are considered customary international law, which means they are binding on all nations.
What is the difference between socialism and communism?
In practice, there is little distinction between the two systems, which both rely on the elimination of private property and the collective ownership of goods. But in theory, there are distinctions between the two. According to Marxism, socialism is a transition state between capitalism and communism. In socialism, the state, or government, still exists, and is in control of property and the programs for collectivization. Marxist theory holds that communism is the final stage of society after the state has dissolved. In a communist society, economic goods and property are distributed equally among the people.
What does the UN do?
Representatives of member countries work to keep peace and ensure security for people around the globe. Over the decades, the UN has expanded its role as a provider of humanitarian aid and stepped up its efforts in the area of human rights. When disputes arise, the UN works toward diplomatic resolution. Though not always successful in its role as peacekeeper or peace negotiator, the organization has provided a forum for debate, which has prevented some disputes from developing into major wars. And through its various agencies, the UN provides assistance to developing nations, promotes humanitarian causes, and sends relief to war-torn areas. However, critics have charged the international organization with arbitrarily defining borders between countries, saying that these drawn boundaries divide ethnic groups and result in conflicts, such as in the Middle East and Africa.
What does Epicurean mean?
While Epicurean has come to refer to anything relating to the pleasure of eating and drinking, it is an oversimplification of the beliefs of the Greek philosopher Epicurus, 341 to 270 B.C., from whose name the word was derived. While Epicurus did believe that pleasure is the only good, and that it alone should be humankind's pursuit, later scholars misinterpreted the philosophy as a license for sensory excess. In actuality, Epicurus defined pleasure not as unbridled sensuality but as freedom from pain and as peace of mind, which can only be obtained through simple living. In about 306 BC, Epicurus established a school in Athens, which came to be known as the Garden School because residents provided for their own food by gardening. There he and his students strived to lead lives of simplicity, prudence, justice, and honor. In this way, they achieved tranquility, the ultimate goal in life. According to the philosophy of Epicureanism, he further believed that intellectual pleasures are superior to sensual pleasures, which are fleeting. In fact, he held that one of the greatest and most enduring pleasures is friendship. These ideas were put forth by the Greek philosopher and writer Lucretius, c. 99 c. 55 BC, in his poem On the Nature of Things. While the Epicurean school endured for several centuries, ultimately Christian leaders deemed the philosophy a pagan creed. However, some critics have posited that the writer of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament of the Bible was likely a member of the Garden School and that the epistles of St. Paul in the New Testament were strongly influenced by Epicurean thought. In more recent times, Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, author and signatory of the Declaration of Independence and third President of the United States, was a self-proclaimed Epicurean.
When was the first newspaper published?
Newspapers, publications that are issued regularly, usually daily or weekly, to notify readers of current events, had their first recorded appearance about 59 B. c. When Romans posted a daily handwritten news report in public places. The report was called the Acta Diurna, or Daily Events. In about AD 700 the Chinese developed the world's first printed newspaper. Called the Daibao, it was printed from carved wooden blocks. The invention of the movable type printing press, c. 1450, spurred the development of the newspaper as we know it. In Germany regularly published newspapers began being circulated in the early 1600s. Newspapers proliferated in the 1800s after the development of a machine that allowed paper to be produced in sheets of any size.
Why did Andrew Johnson vow he would burn Nashville before surrendering it?
It seems a strange thing for a politician to say about his home state's capital city. Andrew Johnson had served Tennessee in both the U.S. House of Representatives 1843-53 and the U.S. Senate 1857-62. He had also been governor 1853-57. But after the Civil War broke out, the Southern Democrat made a surprising move. He sided with the Union. This show of allegiance was largely owing to Johnson's strongly held belief that the South's secession was unconstitutional. Having thus made his stand, President Abraham Lincoln, 1809-1865, saw fit to appoint Johnson as the Union's military governor in Tennessee. When rebel forces surrounded Nashville and seemed poised to take it, Johnson proclaimed he would sooner burn the city before surrendering it. But he was forced to do neither. In mid-December 1864 Union forces used the hand-cranked Gatling gun, invented in 1861, to help defeat the Confederate forces.
What was the Atlantic Charter?
On the eve of direct U.S. involvement in World War II, 1939-45, President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882-1945, met with British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. 1874-1965, on board a ship off the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. There the two leaders drew up a program of peace objectives known as the Atlantic Charter, which they signed on August 14, 1941. In addition to other peacetime goals, the charter roughly contained Roosevelt's four freedoms, which he had outlined in his speech to Congress on January 6, 1941. As the legislative body considered passage of the Lend-Lease Act, Roosevelt believed that freedom of speech and expression, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear should prevail around the world. Briefly, in the Atlantic Charter the two leaders stated that neither of their countries sought new territories, that they respected the right of the people of each country to choose their own form of government, that no country, great or small, victor or vanquished, would be deprived access to the raw materials it needed for its own economic prosperity. That countries should cooperate to improve labor standards and social security, that after the final destruction of the Nazi tyranny, all the men in all the lands may live out their lives in freedom from fear and want, and that a wider and permanent system of general security would be necessary to ensure peace. This last statement alludes to the future establishment of the United Nations.
What does Viva Zapata mean?
It was the cry that went up in support of the rebel General Emiliano Zapata, 1879–1919. Whose chief concern during the Mexican Revolution, 1910–20, was the distribution of land to the people. An advocate of Mexico's lower classes, Zapata began revolutionary activities against the government of Porfirio Diaz. 1830–1915, as early as 1897. Zapata rose to prominence in helping the liberal and idealistic Francisco Madero. 1873–1913, overthrow Diaz in 1911. With Madero placed in power, Zapata promptly began pressing his co-conspirator for a program to distribute the hacienda, large estate, lands to the peasants. Rebuffed by Madero that same year, Zapata drafted the agrarian plan of Ayala and renewed the revolution. Madero's government never achieved stability and proved to be ineffective, prompting a second overthrow in 1913. Victoriano Huerta, 1854–1916, seized power from Madero, whom he had helped put into office, and in the chaos surrounding the coup, Madero was shot and killed. But Zapata refused to support Huerta and remained a leader of the revolution, continuing his crusade for the people who supported him with cheers of Viva Zapata, meaning Long Live Zapata. The bitter fighting of the revolution continued, and soon those who had supported the slain Madero, including Zapata and Pancho Villa, 1878–1923, threw their backing behind another revolutionary, Venustiano Carranza, 1859–1920. In 1914 Carranza's forces occupied Mexico City and forced Huerta to leave the country. No sooner had Carranza taken office than the revolutionaries began fighting among themselves. Zapata and Pancho Villa demanded dramatic reforms, and together they attacked Mexico City in 1914. 5 years later, and 1 year before the end of the revolution, Carranza's army ambushed and assassinated Zapata in his home state of Morelos.
What was the first mail order company?
The mail order business was pioneered by retailer Montgomery Ward and Company. Founded in 1872 in Chicago when American merchant Aaron Montgomery Ward, 1843–1913. Set up shop over a livery stable and printed a one-sheet catalog of bargains. Midwestern farmers, hurt by low farm prices and rising costs, were a ready market for the value-priced goods, which were shipped by rail to rural customers. Originally called the Original Grange Supply House, Montgomery Ward offered 30 dry goods priced at $1 or less and provided special terms of sale for Grange members. The Grange is an association of farmers. Ward bought merchandise directly from wholesalers and, since he did not maintain a store building, overhead was low. By 1876 Ward's catalog had grown to 150 pages, in 1884 it was 240 pages and offered nearly 10,000 products, including household items, such as furniture, cutlery, and writing paper. Farm implements, such as harnesses and tools, and fashions, such as ready-made apparel and parasols. Ward offered customers satisfaction or your money back. In 1886 American Richard W. Sears, 1863 to 1914, entered the mail order business, opening operations in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He moved the business to Chicago the following year and sold it in 1889. In 1893 he joined with Alva C. Roebuck, 1864 to 1948, to found Sears, Roebuck and Company. The Sears catalog, which soon consisted of hundreds of pages and thousands of items, became popularly known as the Wish Book. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck were aided by the U.S. Postal Service's expansion into remote areas. Beginning in 1896 mail could be delivered via the RFD, Rural Free Delivery. In 1913 parcel post was added to the Postal Service's offerings, further benefiting the mail order houses and their growing lists of customers. Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck offered rural America more than merchandise. The mail order houses were farm families linked to the greater consumer society that was emerging at the turn of the century. Regardless of geography, rural Americans could purchase store-bought goods. Manufactured goods that were mass-produced in factories. The mail order houses offered customers convenience, since customer purchases no longer had to be deferred for the next trip to a town. Variety, since catalogers catered to a nationwide customer base. On-hand inventory included a multitude of products, and low prices. The mail order houses bought merchandise at reduced rates from the wholesalers. Fashions were no longer restricted to the middle and upper-class city dwellers who had access to department stores. Rural customers became aware of new styles each time the Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck catalogs were delivered, which, by the early 1900s, was twice a year. Though both Montgomery Ward and Sears Roebuck exited the mail order business to concentrate efforts on their chain store retail operations later in the century, they set the standard for modern mail order houses through their early policies addressing merchandise returns, competitive pricing, flexible payment methods, and shipping terms.
Why are Kant's philosophies still relevant?
Immanuel Kant, 1724–1804, remains one of the great modern thinkers because he developed a whole new philosophy. One that completely reinterpreted human knowledge. a professor at Germany's Königsberg University beginning in 1755. Kant lectured widely and was a prolific writer. His most important work came somewhat late in life after 1775.
When did the big band era begin?
On December 1, 1934, Benny Goodman's Let's Dance was broadcast on network radio, which effectively launched the swing era, in which big band music achieved huge popularity. Goodman, 1909 to 1986, was a virtuoso clarinetist and bandleader. His jazz-influenced dance band took the lead in making swing the most popular style of the time.
How many nations are members of the UN today?
In 2005, the United Nations, UN, membership stood at 191 nations, with the most recent additions having been Switzerland and Timor-Leste, East Timor, in 2002. The membership of the UN grew steadily after it was founded in 1945. Originally there were 51 member states, including Canada, France, the United Kingdom, the USSR, today the Russian Federation, and the United States. Within a decade, 25 more countries had been added to the UN's membership roster. By 1965 there were 117 members, by 1975 144 members, by 1985 159 members, and by 1995 185 members.
Invented by Englishman Henry John Lawson, 1852?
The bicycle had wheels of equal size and a bike chain, to drive the rear wheel. This practical design was improved again in 1895 when air-filled, pneumatic, tires were added. Mass production of the safety bicycle began in 1885. Even after the advent of the automobile, the bicycle continued to figure prominently in everyday life. In the United States, bicycle riding became a leisure pursuit that rivaled baseball in popularity. Cycling clubs emerged. The tandem, the bicycle built for two, allowed American youths an opportunity for courtship. Further, the bicycle industry produced some of the great innovators in transportation, including bicycle designer Charles Duryea, 1861 to 1938, who, with his brother Frank, 1869 to 1967, demonstrated the first successful gas-powered car in the United States, and brothers Wilbur, 1867 to 1912, and Orville, 1871 to 1948, Wright, who were the first to successfully build and fly an airplane.
Since the beauty of the manuscript, what was the first American newspaper?
America's first regular newspaper was the Weekly Newsletter, published by Boston postmaster John Campbell, 1653 to 1728. It was published for nearly 2 decades, between 1704 and 1722, and consisted of a single 7 by 11-inch sheet of paper covered on both sides with news. Not all of it substantiated, from post riders, sea captains, and sailors. By 1765 there were more than 20 newspapers in the American colonies. Was meant to represent the spiritual beauty of the text, usually Gospels. Psalms, prayers, or meditations, sacred books became increasingly ornamental. Some books of hours, devotional books developed during the 1300s, are considered masterpieces of illumination. The works, c. 1409-16, of Belgian illuminators Paul Herman and Johanniken Limburg represent the height of painted religious manuscripts.
When was slavery outlawed in Europe?
The slave trade ended in Britain in 1807, when authorities agreed with the growing number of abolitionists. Those who argued that slavery is immoral and violates Christian beliefs, and outlawed the trade. In 1833 slavery was abolished throughout the British colonies as the culmination of the great anti-slavery movement in Great Britain. In the United States, the slave trade was prohibited in 1808, but possessing slaves was still legal. Consequently, trade on the black market continued until Britain stepped up its enforcement of its anti-slavery law by conducting naval blockades and surprise raids off the African coast, effectively closing the trade. The slave trade as it had been known officially came to an end after 1870, when it was outlawed throughout the Americas. Throughout the world, the United Nations works to abolish slavery and other systems of forced labor.
How old is tennis?
The game is believed to have originated in France, where it was called jeu de paume, meaning game of the palm, in the 1100s or 1200s. Players hit a small ball back and forth over a net using the palms of their hands. The father of modern tennis is English soldier and sportsman Walter Clopton Wingfield, known as Major Wingfield 1833 to 1912, who in 1873 published a rule book for lawn tennis and in 1874 patented equipment for the game.
What is Zen?
Also called Zen Buddhism, it is a sect of Buddhism practiced predominantly in Japan and China. The religion is based on meditation rather than on the strict moral doctrine of Buddhism. It was founded in China in the 5th century AD by Bodhidharma, an Indian Buddhist monk and missionary. He taught that sudden enlightenment can be achieved through the practice of meditation, or wall gazing. The religion defines enlightenment as the direct seeing of one's original nature.
What are the characteristics of Botticelli's paintings?
The works of Sandro Botticelli, 1445 to 1510, one of the early painters of the Italian Renaissance, are known for their serene compositions, refined elegance, and spirituality. A student of Florentine painter Fra Filippo Lippi, 1406 to 1469. Botticelli refined Lippi's method of drawing such that he is considered one of the great masters of the line. Botticelli's work was soon eclipsed by that of Leonardo da Vinci, 1452 to 1519. Who was just a few years younger than he, but whose range of talents made Botticelli's work seem dated. Nevertheless, late in the 19th century, Botticelli began to be revered again by artists and critics alike, who hailed his works for their simplicity and sincerity. English art critic John Ruskin, 1819 to 1900, held Botticelli up as an example of an artist who presented nature as an expression of a divinely created world.
How is the attitude of the Renaissance characterized?
The artists and thinkers of the Renaissance, like the ancient Greeks and Romans, valued earthly life, glorified man's nature, and celebrated individual achievement. These new attitudes combined to form a new spirit of optimism. The belief that man was capable of accomplishing great things. This outlook was the result of the activities of the wealthy mercantile class in northern Italy, who, aside from supporting the arts and letters, also began collecting the classical texts that had been forgotten during the Middle Ages, 500-1350. Ancient manuscripts were taken to libraries, where scholars from around Europe could study them. The rediscovery of classical texts prompted a new way of looking at the world. During the Middle Ages, scholars argued that the meaning of life on earth lay primarily in its relation to an afterlife. Therefore, they believed that art for its own sake had no value. And they even frowned on the recognition of individual talent. For this reason, many of the great works of the Middle Ages were created anonymously or were hidden from public view. In contrast, Renaissance artists and thinkers studied classical works for the purpose of imitating them. As an expression of their new optimism, Renaissance scholars embraced the study of classical subjects that addressed human, rather than scientific, concerns. These humanities, as they came to be called, included language and literature, art, history, rhetoric, and philosophy. Above all, humanists, those who espoused the values of this type of education, believed in man's potential to become well versed in many areas. Thus, A Renaissance man is anyone whose talents span a variety of disciplines. During the Renaissance, people in all disciplines began using critical skills as a means of understanding everything from nature to politics.
Why did so many Americans protest U.S. involvement in the Vietnam War?
The Vietnam War, 1954–75, divided the American public. The anti-war movement maintained that the conflict in Southeast Asia did not pose a risk to U.S. security, contrary to the domino effect that Washington, D.C. foresaw. And in the absence of a threat to national security, protesters wondered, what are we fighting for? Meanwhile, President Lyndon B. Johnson, 1908–1973, slowly stepped up the number of troops sent to Vietnam. Many never came home, and those who did came home changed. Mass protests were held, including the hallmark of the era, the sit-in. Protesters accused the U.S. government of not only involving Americans in a conflict in which the country had no part, but of supporting a corrupt, unpopular and undemocratic government in South Vietnam. Those Americans who supported the nation's fight against communism eventually became frustrated by the United States' inability to achieve a decisive victory in Vietnam. Even for the so-called hawks, who supported the war, the mounting costs of the war hit home when President Johnson requested new taxes. As the casualty count soared, public approval of U.S. participation in Vietnam dropped. By the end of the 1960s, under increasing public pressure, the government began to withdraw American troops from Vietnam. The evacuation of the ground troops was not complete until 1973. But even then, soldiers who were missing in action, MIAs, and prisoners of war, POWs, were left behind.
What was the Abu Ghraib prison scandal?
News of the atrocities of Abu Ghraib, where Iraqi prisoners were being held by members of the U.S. military during Operation Iraqi Freedom, first surfaced in April 2004 when shocking photographs began appearing in the American media. The photos depicted an array of hideous abuses, all of them in violation of the Geneva Conventions for the Treatment of Prisoners of War. The deep troubles first surfaced in spring 2003 when International Red Cross and human rights groups complained that American troops had been mistreating Iraqi prisoners. The U.S. Army launched an investigation into its prison system. A fact-finding mission was eventually led by Major General Antonio Taguba, who completed his report in February 2004. It stated that one police company at Abu Ghraib had committed sadistic, blatant, and wanton criminal abuses. The Taguba report also found that supervisory omission was rampant at the prison. More investigations and reports followed, taking into account other prisons under central command. Some of the reports tied prisoner deaths to the abuses. The scandal sent shockwaves around the world and sparked an intense debate about how such abuses could have happened. The tortures were labeled by some as unauthorized actions taken by a few individuals. But others believed they were a manifestation of policy that had gone wrong. The scandal soon widened. By May 2004, British newspapers began reporting abuses by British troops. While Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953, apologized for any mistreatment Iraqi prisoners may have suffered at the hands of British troops, President Bush went on Arabic television to denounce the abuses as abhorrent. He stopped short of an apology, saying that the mistreatment does not represent the America that I know. Both nations moved quickly to bring charges against several soldiers shown in the pictures. The guilty verdicts, and subsequent sentences, began being handed down in May 2004. The prison scandals fueled criticism of the controversial war in Iraq. They also prompted a deadly backlash from the Arab world. Insurgents in Iraq began a series of kidnappings of Americans and British citizens working in Iraq, most of them ending in ghastly and widely publicized killings. Between spring 2004 and spring 2005, more than 200 foreigners were taken captive in Iraq. More than 30 of them were killed by their kidnappers.
Why do historians draw comparisons among Stalin, Hitler, Napoleon, and Alexander the Great?
All four men were fiercely powerful and seemingly indomitable leaders. And their early lives and careers shared some interesting characteristics as well. First, none of them were native sons of the countries they ended up ruling, and some would say, defining. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, 1879–1953, was born in Georgia. German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, in Austria. French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769–1821, in Corsica, which, though technically a new possession of France, was decidedly more Italian in nature. And King of the Macedonians Alexander the Great, 356–323 BC, was from the fringe city-state of Macedonia. Yet it was, respectively, Russian, German, French, and Greek culture that each leader spread. All four men rose to power through the military, or, in Alexander's case, who succeeded his father, after having carried out military strategy. Once installed as rulers, all led fantastic military campaigns to expand their spheres of influence. The wars brought on by their nationalism left millions dead. Finally, all four men inspired, and some would say continue to inspire, terror in the human soul. Still, history has been more forgiving of both Alexander and Napoleon, who today seem to be portrayed as often as heroes as they are as megalomaniacs. With Hitler's and Stalin's horrible legacies a more recent memory. The view of these men is decidedly and far more consistently dark and loathsome.
What happened in the anthrax scare of 2001?
The anthrax scare unfolded shortly after the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. When news first broke that anthrax-laced letters were received at East Coast media outlets and U.S. congressional offices, there were fears that the spreading of the infectious bacterium was linked to the 9/11 attacks. But the investigation later pointed toward a domestic perpetrator, still unknown in mid-2005. According to a report from the Office of Homeland Security, the anthrax events began on October 2, 2001, when an infectious disease doctor in Palm Beach County, Florida, reported a suspected case of inhalation anthrax. That diagnosis was confirmed by the Centers for Disease Control, CDC. On October 4 and the information was released to the public, rattling the nerves of an already jittery nation. On October 5 the first victim of the anthrax attacks, the 63-year-old South Florida man who had been hospitalized, died. On October 7 investigators announced that evidence of the anthrax bacterium was found in his workplace. The Florida offices of American Media Inc. AMI, publisher of the National Enquirer, Sun, and other tabloids. On October 12 New York Mayor Rudolph Giuliani announced that an NBC News employee in the office of anchorman Tom Brokaw had tested positive for cutaneous, skin, anthrax, a less dangerous form of the bacterium. 3 days later, it was reported that a letter containing suspicious powder was opened in the office of Senator Tom Dashley, South Dakota, in the Hart Senate Office Building in Washington, D.C. The next day the powder tested positive for anthrax. October 16 brought the news that the infant son of an ABC News producer in New York City had tested positive for exposure to the skin form of anthrax. The baby had visited the ABC News offices weeks earlier, and officials believed exposure had occurred at that time. The same day, it was announced that a second AMI worker, a 73-year-old mailroom employee, was diagnosed with inhalation anthrax and was in intensive care. The announcements brought the number of confirmed anthrax cases to 4, 2 inhalation and 2 cutaneous. Within days CDC officials had linked all 4 cases to the intentional delivery of B. anthracis spores through mailed letters or packages. The FBI urged the public to handle any suspicious packages with care, to not open, smell, or taste them, and to call 911 immediately. On October 18 a worker at CBS News in New York was reported to have been infected with skin anthrax. The next day the public learned that an editorial assistant in the Manhattan offices of the New York Post had also been diagnosed with the skin form of the disease. Also on October 18 and 19 the CDC confirmed diagnoses of both inhalation and cutaneous anthrax in New Jersey postal workers, who had begun showing symptoms of infection on October 13. Between October 19 and 22 4 workers from a Washington, D.C. postal facility were confirmed to have been infected with inhalation anthrax and were hospitalized. On October 22, 2 of them died. 2 days later, the U.S. Postmaster General announced to the public, "There are no guarantees that the mail is safe," and he advised hand-washing after handling the mail. On October 31, a New York hospital worker died of inhalation anthrax, becoming the fourth fatality. But investigators could not determine how the woman had been exposed to the bacterium. By mid-November, traces of anthrax had been discovered in mail facilities that supplied the CIA. The Senate and House office buildings, the Supreme Court, Walter Reed Army Institute of Research, the White House. Washington, D.C.'s Brentwood Mail Processing and Distribution Center, Washington, D.C.'s Southwest Postal Station. A Kansas City postal facility, the Pentagon's post office, and 4 more New Jersey postal facilities. Antibiotics were distributed to thousands of workers as a preventive measure. On November 16, an anthrax-laced letter addressed to Senator Patrick Leahy, Vermont, was discovered in a batch of quarantined Capitol Hill mail. The handwriting, all uppercase, was similar to that in the letter addressed to Senator Dashley. And the 2 letters carried identical messages: September 11, 01/"You cannot stop us" "We have the anthrax" "You die now" "Are you afraid" "Death to America" "Death to Israel" "Allah is great." The letters sent to the senators were postmarked October 9, 2001, in Trenton, New Jersey. The message and handwriting in those letters were also similar to those in letters addressed to the editor of the New York Post and to Tom Brokaw at NBC News, both of which read, September 11, 01/ "This is next/ "Take penicillin sick now/ "Death to America/ "Death to Israel/ "Allah is great." The letters sent to the media outlets were postmarked September 18, 2001, also in Trenton, New Jersey. The Franklin Park, New Jersey return address was identical on all 4 letters. But it was a non-existent location. Investigators believed that whoever sent out the deadly missives was familiar with the area. On November 20 it was confirmed that an elderly Connecticut woman, who had died the day before, had been infected with anthrax. The 94-year-old was believed to have been exposed to a letter that had been cross-contaminated in the mail. All 5 anthrax deaths were caused by the inhalation form of the bacterium. In total, 22 cases of anthrax were identified between October 4 and November 20, 11 of them were the deadly inhalation form. 6 people survived, and 11 were the less serious skin form. In all but 2 cases, the New York hospital worker and the elderly Connecticut woman. The victims were mail handlers or were exposed to work sites that had been contaminated by mail. Investigators concluded that all of the anthrax spores were of the same strain, called Ames, but that the letters contained different grades of the bacterium. By November 9, 2001, the FBI had issued a behavioral/linguistic assessment of the offender based on the known anthrax parcels. The offender is believed to be an adult male who has access to a source of anthrax and possesses the knowledge and expertise to refine it. The FBI headed a multi-agency effort to identify the perpetrator of the deadly attacks.
What does the letter X in Malcolm X's name stand for?
The influential but controversial African-American leader, who was a staunch defendant of black rights, took the surname X in 1952, upon his release from prison. He explained that the letter stood for the unknown African name of his ancestors. Malcolm X's family's name, Little, was that given to his slave ancestors by their owner. By adopting X as his surname, it was at once a bitter reminder of his family's slavery and an affirmation of his unknown African roots.
How did the Renaissance begin?
Social and political developments in the late Middle Ages gave rise to the spirit of the Renaissance. The Crusades, 1096 to 1291, the military expeditions undertaken by Christian powers to win the Holy Land from the Muslims brought Europeans into contact with other cultures and most importantly with Byzantine civilization. The remnant of the East Roman Empire, Byzantium had preserved the knowledge of ancient times. In addition, many texts thought to have been destroyed during the tribal ransacking of the West Roman Empire in the 5th century AD, remained preserved in various translations throughout the Middle East. So it was during the Crusades that some of these were brought back to Europe, where classical scholars undertook the task of deciphering the West's cultural past. In northern Italy, a series of city-states developed independent of the larger empires to the north and south of them. These small states, Florence, Rome, Venice, and Milan, among others, gained prosperity through trade and banking. And as a result, a wealthy class of businessmen emerged. These community leaders admired and encouraged creativity, patronizing artists who might glorify their commercial achievement with great buildings, paintings, and sculptures. The most influential patrons of the arts were the Medicis, a wealthy banking family in Florence. Members of the Medici family supported many important artists, including Botticelli and Michelangelo. Guided by the Medici patronage, Florence became the most magnificent city of the period. One way patrons encouraged art was to sponsor competitions. In order to spur artists to more significant achievement. In many cases, the losers of these contests went on to greater fame than the winners. After his defeat in the competition to create the bronze doors of the Baptistery of Florence Cathedral, architect Filippo Brunelleschi, 1377 to 1446, made several trips to take measurements of the ruined buildings of ancient Rome. When he returned to Florence, he created the immense Il Duomo, dome, of the Santa Maria del Fiore Cathedral. A classically influenced structure that became the first great monument of the Renaissance.